Continuing education knows that at the end, students want to graduate, and we can help them do that because we take the time to really listen to their needs and we understand all the different options that are available across the campus for them.
We don't take a cookie cutter approach. We realize each student comes with their own story. So whether it's a part-time student looking to complete a degree program or someone just looking for online courses, we're there to connect them to the resources of the university.
All right, I think we're just about ready to get started here. My name is Braden Deffenbaugh. I'm so ecstatic to be moderating this panel on freedom of speech today. For recording purposes, today is Wednesday, April 10th. It is just about 1:30 or 1:31 p.m. This is panel number 17987, titled Freedom of Expression. Don't tell me what to say, do, or think. Before we get started, the University of Colorado Boulder, Colorado's flagship university, honors and recognizes the many contributions of Indigenous peoples in our state. CU Boulder acknowledges that it is located on the traditional territories and ancestral homelands of the Cheyenne, Arapaho, Ute, and many other Native American nations. Their forced removal of these territories has caused devastating and lasting impacts, and while the University of Colorado Boulder can never undo or rectify the devastation wrought on Indigenous peoples, we commit to improving and enhancing engagement with Indigenous peoples and issues locally and globally. We will do this by recognizing and amplifying the voices of Indigenous CU Boulder students, staff, and faculty and their work, educating, conducting research, supporting student success, and integrating Indigenous knowledge, and by consulting, engaging, and working collaboratively with tribal nations to enhance our ability to provide access and culturally sensitive support, and to recruit, retain, and graduate Native American students in a climate that is inclusive and respectful. Before we begin, I also would like to talk about one other thing, which is to be sure to ask questions. We will have a note card system with our wonderful producers in the back. If you just raise your hand, they will hand you a small note card and a pencil. Feel free to jot down whatever you want. It's not in my interest to editorialize your questions on a free speech panel, so go crazy. And if you are a student, make sure to notify that on the card so that way I prioritize your question above other ones. And also, please write legibly. I very often cannot read normal people's handwriting, and so any extra effort to help me read this question so that way I can get your question best answered is in all of our best interests. And now I'd like to do a brief introduction on each panelist. For more information, you can find their full bios on the CU website. First, we have Marcus Brauckley, a Boulder native and Boulder High School alumnus who has been a participant for decades that we love having back here at CWA. He's the founder of North Base Media and has previously served as the executive editor for the Washington Post after his 24 years working for the Wall Street Journal. We also are honored to have Ms. Hayter Harris, the interim DC director at PEN America, a nonprofit that supports literature and freedom of expression. She is an award-winning civil rights attorney and works tirelessly as a champion of freedom of expression, both domestically and abroad. Tirelessly. We also have Mr. Leo Gleis, a history teacher of 18 years. He focuses his curriculum upon the creativity of his students and provides them with historical analysis through the lenses of oppressed peoples and their untold stories. He also consults all around Southern California, helping teachers improve their own curriculum. And lastly, we have Ian Millhiser, a senior correspondent for Vox, where he focuses on the Supreme Court of the United States, the Constitution, and the decline of the US political system as a liberal democracy. He served as a clerk in the US Appellate Court and was a member of Teach for America in the Mississippi Delta. He's also written 2 books on the Supreme Court and its historical and contemporary state. I'm very excited to be here and very excited to hear all of your thoughts on this freedom of speech. I think that first we should start off with, we'll start off with your opening statements, first of all.
All right. I think we decided I was going to go first?
Yes.
All right. So I've been experiencing a bit of whiplash lately. I'm a Supreme Court reporter. I covered constitutional politics for close to 20 years now. And there used to be a consensus on the First Amendment. We get First Amendment cases that came up in front of the Supreme Court. Most of them had enormous bipartisan majorities, and it didn't matter how offensive the speech was. There was a case called Snyder v. Phelps several years ago, which involved people who thought it was a good idea to stand outside of a dead Marine's funeral holding signs saying, "Thank God for dead soldiers." Most offensive speech you can possibly imagine. Supreme Court 8-1 said that's protected speech. There's a case called U.S. v. Stevens a while back. This was a case about what are called crush videos. I don't want to describe them in too much detail because they will nauseate you, but they were fetish videos for people who get off on animal cruelty. And the Supreme Court said, you can ban the literal killing of animals, but they said that these videos were, in fact, free speech. There was a very broad pro-speech consensus. It cut across both political parties. Both these were 8-1 decisions. Only Alito dissented. And that's how I thought things worked when it came to free speech issues. If anything, Republicans tended to think that the First Amendment should be more expansive, because Republican justices believe that the First Amendment should encompass everything that the Democrats thought it should encompass, plus campaign finance laws. That was Citizens United. They thought, in addition to having the right to free speech, you should also have the right to give to a super PAC. And that was how things were. And then, in the post-Trump world, we are learning that that is no longer the case. You see books being pulled off of school libraries in Florida. You see don't say gay laws. You see many states passing bans on drag performances. The first drag ban case just reached the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court refused to strike it down. They'll probably strike it down later. But we are losing this consensus. Both Trump and Ron DeSantis has tried to put bills through the Florida legislature on this, want to overrule a seminal Supreme Court case called New York Times v. Sullivan, which is the font of press freedom in the United States. I can get into more detail on that if you want, but you can't have press freedom in the U.S. without New York Times v. Sullivan. And the good news is that for now, the First Amendment seems to be hanging on. So you've got 6 Republicans on the Supreme Court, and right now they're pretty split down the middle. Roberts, Kavanaugh, and Barrett tend to take the traditional Republican position that free speech is good, and they tend to vote with the Democrats on most free speech issues. Thomas, Alito, and to a lesser extent Gorsuch. Gorsuch is a little more idiosyncratic in this space, but they tend to vote with Trump. They tend to vote for much more restrictive approaches to free speech. And it's just very surprising to me, having grown up in a country where I just assumed that everyone thought that free speech was a good idea, and where our politics reflected that. Again, the Republican Party did not have a very different position than the Democratic Party on free speech for almost my entire life and almost my entire career covering these issues. And I think that the reasons why we're seeing this now are cultural rather than political. So I just want to offer 2 thoughts on why we're seeing this now, and then I will shut up and let other people speak. One is that I think we're seeing a democratization of business etiquette. And what I mean by that is that we're living through the success of the civil rights movement right now. We're living through the success of the feminist movement right now. And this is not a total success. I want to be clear, we have not solved racism in the United States. The median white household income is about $74,000. The median black household income in the United States is about $48,000. So about 2/3 of a white family. So we have not by any means solved these issues. But we have achieved in many workplaces what the Supreme Court referred to in its Grutter v. Bollinger decision as a critical mass. There are behaviors that women have always found obnoxious. And in the Mad Men era, they just didn't speak up. when those behaviors took place in the workplace because they didn't feel like they had the cultural and political stature to be able to do so. Now they do. And so men are being asked to behave in a different way, not because it's suddenly our values changed, but because women are now in a position to say, look, this has always bothered me. There's some behaviors that have always bothered many black people. There's some behaviors that have always bothered many Latinos. There's some behaviors that have always bothered whatever demographic group that you want to insert. And the thing that has changed is that now they have the power to insist that the etiquette of their business, of their place of work, aligns with what those realities are. Now, I will tell you as a white person who has lived through this shift, it is sometimes frustrating. I have learned to code switch, and let me tell you, that shit sucks. Like, it is not fun. Well, as a white person, I entered the workplace in a world where the etiquette of my place of business was tailor-made for me, because people looked like me were the only people who had a say in it for so long. Now it's not tailor-made for me, and that means I have had to learn to speak differently in a professional setting than I would in my home, which is a skill that people who do not look like me have had to learn their entire lives. It's hard, and it's frustrating, and I think that unfortunately, there are too many voters who see their own struggle with this new reality, and they are not contextualizing it. They're not seeing why it is happening and understanding that, look, I find it frustrating, but I don't have a right to insist that my place of business be tailor-made for me. I have colleagues, and they have as much of a right to dictate the business etiquette as everything else. And then the other thing that I think is driving this right now, and then I promise I will shut up, social media is an accelerant. There is an article, if you follow left of center media, you've probably read this article a dozen times. It's published every year. Someone publishes some version of this argument around Martin Luther King Day. And it's a kind of takedown of the I Have a Dream speech. It's a left takedown of the I Have the Dream speech. And the argument is essentially that Martin Luther King had a very radical agenda, which is true. The I Have a Dream speech did not capture the full scope of his anti-poverty agenda. It did not capture the full scope of the anti-war agenda. And that on Martin Luther King Day, we shouldn't just play that one speech. We should be aware of the full radicalism of his agenda. All of that is descriptively true. But there's an explanation for why that speech did not capture the full breadth of his agenda. And that's because Dr. Martin Luther King was an extraordinarily effective political advocate. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference had a political agenda, a lobbying agenda that they were trying to get through Congress. And so he gave a speech that advanced the specific political goals that they were trying to advance in 1963, and which actually became law in 1964 and 1965. Political groups, smart political activists have always thought about when is the right time for me to bring something up? When is the right time for me to push on this? When is it time? That's just something we all do in our social action. When I find someone obnoxious in my personal life, I don't always bring it up. You think strategically. I think what social media has changed is that someone's always going to bring it up. And there's always going, and once it's brought up, the tweet is going to go viral or whatever. And so now we no longer, groups that historically had the ability to think strategically and think, do I really want to bring this thing up right now? Now every grievance is being brought up simultaneously. And so I think that in that environment, it's very easy to get the impression that something has changed very radically. All of a sudden, all these people are agitating who have never, and that is not true. What has happened is that individuals now have more ability to put things on the agenda. And so we've seen, I think, structural changes, which I think are largely positive. More connectivity is good. A work environment where everyone has input into the business of their workplace is good. But it has produced this tremendous political backlash. And I'll close more or less with where I started, which is that right now the First Amendment is holding on. Right now we have a 6-justice majority in favor of the Sixth Amendment. If Trump wins, he needs to appoint 2 people and we lose it.
Thank you for that. That was very powerful, very insightful on that. Leo, do you want to continue with the opening remarks?
Yeah, I guess it's kind of hard following that up, but I will attempt to do my best. You know, restrictions on free speech have always been tried in this country, whether we are talking about the Alien and Sedition Acts in the 1700s, or whether we're talking about Texas v. Johnson and, you know, burning a flag. That part should be not surprising to us. Like, what we're seeing today is not something that's happening in a vacuum, but it is unfortunately sort of like the process repeating itself over and over again. And even in like the global, you know, construct of like, you know, banning books, like that is something that also isn't uncommon. It is something that has happened throughout history. We can date back all the way back to, you know, ancient China. And we can take it all the way through Nazi Germany. We can take it all the way back through, you know, medieval Europe and, you know, scientific theory of, you know, the earth, you know, God forbid, actually revolving around the sun, and, you know, not everything else revolving around the earth, and, you know, some of the consequences that came with that. So when it comes to book banning today, hopefully we're not surprised by it. It is something that has always happened. And I guess, you know, to kind of shorten up my intro speech, I try to think about, as humans and as adults, which we all are in this room, you know, what do we want for young people in this country? And what do we want for young people around the world? You know, what kind of young adults do we actually want to raise? And, you know, what skills and what qualifications and what sorts of like attributes do we want them to have? And then we have to think about how we help them get there. Because when it comes to banning books, in every society and in every place in which that has happened, it has always been done to the benefit of the powerful, and it has always happened to come at the detriment of the masses. And so I think if we can think about it from those points of views, and if we can think about the young people that we see around this campus and around the world and how we want them to inherit this place and make it better, what are the things that we have to do in order to make sure that we can put this into their hands and hopefully let them leave it in a little better place than what we've left for them.
Yep. Go ahead. That was
All right.
excellent, Leo. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm so happy I don't have to say that. There you go. You know, I said I was not going to get feedback, and yet here it is. So my name's Hadar Harris, and I'm a human rights attorney. Let's try that again. Closer?
Do you want to borrow my mic?
Oh, they're not different.
Okay.
Yeah, no, I think it's just a matter of where it is. Okay. Can you hear me okay? Great. So, you know, I'm an international human rights attorney by training and for most of my career. And I joined PEN America just a couple of months ago as the Washington director, the interim Washington director. And I've worked on a lot of different human rights issues tirelessly over the course of my career. And I couldn't figure out why I was having discomfort about some of this work that I was sort of being thrust into around freedom of expression issues. And suddenly on the Metro one day, I live in Washington, D.C., on the Metro, I had this epiphany. And I thought to myself, well, you know what? All the work that I've done over all these years to end torture, to advocate for gender equality, to ensure that there was the right to vote, those are all really easy things to advocate for because they're really clear and they're really precise and we understand them in context. Freedom of expression has tremendous gray areas and a huge history that we sometimes know and that we sometimes don't acknowledge in terms of the fact that there have always been carve-outs in freedom of expression, even in this country that loves the First Amendment, even in this country that takes it for granted in many communities and in other communities which know that the First Amendment might not be fully for them. I want to talk for a second about what's been happening over the last 3 years. Because what we've seen in this country over the past 3 years, again, is not new because there has been book banning in this country over decades and years and many, many times. But it is new in terms of how the pace at which it has spread across the country and the ways in which it's actually been implemented. It's not just book bans. PEN America, since July of 2021, has been tracing 3 kind of major categories that together we call the ed scare, the education scare. First is educational gag orders. Those are the kinds of laws that have been passed, like the Don't Say Gay bill, the Parental Rights in Education bill or law in Florida that says you cannot teach certain subjects. You cannot say certain things coming out of your mouth. You cannot give instruction to students about particular categories of information. And I'll go back to what those categories are in a second. The second are educational intimidation bills. Those are not direct censorship bills. Those are sort of more indirect censorship, where they create a chilling effect so that teachers or librarians or school administrators are kind of worried about being even criminally penalized, because in some states there are criminal penalties for certain kinds of information or instruction or information that teachers are imparting to students. And that creates an overbroad chilling effect so that teachers just will self-censor and not teach about certain things. That leads sometimes preemptively from librarians taking books off the shelves when they don't need to because they're afraid to get in trouble. And then the third category are book bans. And that's where books are actually taken off the shelves, either in order to review them, which might take a really, really, really long time. And so they are taken out of circulation. We count that as a book ban, or to ban them completely. To give you a sense of the scope and a sense of what's actually going on here, there have been hundreds of bills that have been introduced in almost every state in the country in one of those 3 categories, and sometimes in all 3 of those categories. To date, right now, we have at least 40 educational gag order laws in place. We have 39 educational intimidation bills, educational intimidation laws in place. And book bans that have spanned at least 41 different states, where more than 6,000 instances of book bannings have happened. We see a trend and we see a lot of commonality about what's happening across the country. In 2021, 2022, it started with educational gag orders around the teaching of critical race theory and issues of race and slavery, and this concept of critical race theory that actually most of the people that were saying that it was a terrible thing didn't even understand what it meant. There were lots of laws that were passed around divisive concepts. You should be worried that there are state legislators trying to say that we cannot discuss divisive concepts in public schools in the United States. In my mind, that's what public schools are there for. That's what any school is there for, is to actually figure out how to talk about divisive concepts together, how to put them into context, how to understand them, how to critically think about them. But in many states in this country, right now, you have laws in place that do not allow teachers to talk about divisive concepts. So the first phase of these laws and the book bannings and the educational intimidation laws were around race. Then it moved into, last year, want to guess? LGBTQ plus issues. Anything having to do with sexual orientation or sexual identity, that was the focus. Suddenly, the race stuff kind of fell off a little bit, mostly because there was a lot of pushback when somebody actually asked a state legislator, what do you mean by critical race theory? And they couldn't explain it. LGBTQ plus stuff, though, they can explain, and they can actually, go up against. I will tell you, last week I was testifying before the Missouri Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights. I tell you that both because it's cool and it makes me sound cool. And because Missouri, you know, we look at Florida, right? We look at Texas, but states like Missouri are right in the center of all of this. They have a candidate right now running for Secretary of State. And I realize I'm talking too long. I'll stop in a second. They have a candidate right now, 24-year-old Republican candidate, who did a video on all social media platforms where she took a blowtorch to 2 books that she had taken out of the Missouri Public Library that were LGBTQ titles, right? And she blowtorched those books and said, if I become the Secretary of State, this is just the beginning. We'll get rid of those groomer books. She had 3.4 million views of that video on formerly known as Twitter, X, last week when I looked at it. The last category that we've moved now to, and PEN America has a report coming out next week, just flag that, that talks about it, is now talking about sex. Not sexual orientation, but actual sexual acts or sexual material. Okay? So anything having to do with sexual acts, now some of these bills, you know, are very detailed in what they mean by that. And so, you know, it's kind of amusing to read through them and have all these state legislators really outlining all kinds of really very specific sexual acts, which they would never like pronounce from their mouths, but, you know, it's all written there. But it's interpreted in ways that have led to the removal of books like, you know, the Reader's Digest Guide to Drawing and Art, or Catcher in the Rye, which my sophomore just read this year, or a whole variety of books, you know, that you can name, The Bluest Eye, like a whole bunch of different books that have various people having sex in some way or another, right? And not even having sex, kissing each other, doing things that would be far less than what is outlined in those pieces of legislation. So it's important to know, the last thing I'll say is, and we can talk about it in the questions, is that we see a lot of overlap and actual copycat bills that have emerged from, yes, Florida, and have spread across the country. Language in those bills are almost word for word the same. They're spread through very small groups of people. The Washington Post did a story in December that showed that, were you going to use this statistic?
Nope.
Okay, all right, okay. I just want to make sure you weren't going to use it. That something like 60%, right? 60% of all book challenges, out of 1,000 book challenges that they studied, were perpetrated by 11 individuals.
I had that stat in my back pocket.
Okay, all right. I just want to make sure all of us had that one, right? 11 people had 60% of the book challenges. It's a small group of people, well organized, well coordinated. They know the system. They know how to embrace the system, and they are imposing very small minority views on a vast majority of people. I'll leave it there. We can discuss more.
So I'm not going to be able to compete in depth or authority with the people who came before me. I will ask the question that's on everybody's mind, which is, okay, so they write this legislation banning certain things in publications, and the things that they want to ban, they've written in the legislation. So is the legislation itself now in violation of itself?
You know what? If you were to actually give it to a student, it would be, and
nice.
In Missouri, let me tell you, in Missouri, under a law that currently is in effect since July 2022, if you were to actually, as a guest speaker, give the text of that law to students in a classroom, in my understanding,
Any age?
any age, including high school, you could be criminally fined $2,000, found criminally liable for a Class A misdemeanor, and jailed for up to a year. So don't go to Missouri.
So that's super great. That's a fact that everybody should take away from this. They've successfully banned themselves. There's 2 things I want to talk about, but the first one, I'll just be brief. And I think everybody already knows this, but I spent a lot of my life in China, and I read a lot about Chinese history, and many of you will be familiar with the Cultural Revolution, which was obviously driven by somewhat different political agenda than the political agendas in this country today, but we do live in a cultural revolution time. And on both sides, there are things you can say and can't say. And there was a line in China during the Cultural Revolution: better to be read than expert, meaning it's better to be loyal to Maoism, the red son of Mao, than it is to be loyal to facts. Which is why later, when Deng Xiaoping came to power, he talked about seek truth from facts. He was trying to differentiate from that period. Well, in our time, in our country, a lot of people would rather be read than expert in either camp, on the left and on the right, and it's a problem. I want to put on my glasses so I can read my writing. I want to discuss how the First Amendment hasn't been used to hasn't been used to suppress speech, which actually is an interesting little corner of the question around free speech right now. So the free speech problem in America, and I think there is a problem around free speech, not that there shouldn't be free speech, but that free speech is becoming a battlefield. It takes place largely on these giant technology platforms, on Meta, on X, formerly Twitter, on new platforms like Snapchat. And all of these platforms have taken a view, and Silicon Valley, the tech bros who dominate Silicon Valley have a very libertarian view that it's not their job to police content on their platforms. And they invoke, Elon Musk prominently and frequently, they invoke the First Amendment to explain why they do not suppress speech on their platforms. And they fundamentally misunderstand the First Amendment and its relationship to them, because they are companies, they're private companies. And they actually have the right to decide what content to distribute or redistribute or send to people. And they choose not to get involved in that. So you have X and Elon Musk himself, frequently from his own account, promoting recycling, recirculating false information and information that's designed to create and widen fissures in our society. You have Meta and Google, which owns YouTube, declining to do anything about false political speech, because they argue, who are we to get between the voters and political speech? And so if somebody wants to put up an ad on YouTube that's full of false information, they don't get in the way. And just as a slight digression, as a former editor of 2 newspapers, I will tell you that if you tried to put an ad in our newspapers, back when I ran newspapers that contained false information, you were a politician, we would not take your ad. We would not take your ad if you were promoting a product that was in any way fraudulent or deceiving the public. And then finally, the most recent participant in this First Amendment defense of irresponsibility was the newsletter platform Substack, whose founders made the decision, bizarrely, the guy's name is Hamish McKenzie, if you want to look him up. I think he's a New Zealander. Hamish McKenzie made the decision that it would be acceptable for Substack to continue to publish and indeed to monetize, because they take a cut of subscriber income and advertising income, Nazi content on Substack. Because he said, who are we, to interfere with free speech? And I think we actually live in a time where people are irresponsible about their responsibilities under the First Amendment. So.
Do you mind if I jump off?
No, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, I disagree slightly with what you said, because I do think that there is a lot of content moderation that goes on social media. It's just not going on for moral reasons. It's going on for entirely capitalistic reasons.
That's true.
So like, and like, one thing that I think has happened because of this, so like social media companies will not publish a lot of, most of them at least, will not publish a lot of racist content. They will not publish a swastika. If you put it up, they'll make you pull it down. The reason why is nothing to do with any moral judgment whatsoever. It's because their advertisers don't want their ad to run next to a swastika. They don't want it to run next to something that's likely to offend a bunch of people and make them not want to use their product. And this goes back to what I was saying before about the breakdown of the bipartisan consensus for free speech. I think one consequence of this is, as you said, Mark, like these sorts of conversations about what will run next to what ads have gone on in the media business all the time. I mean, during the Trump presidency, we had a lot of advertisers at Vox who didn't want their ad to run next to anything that used the word Trump, because Trump is, a divisive figure, and it was very, made it very hard to raise money when he was the president of the United States, and you had to say his name a lot. There's a lot of advertisers who don't want to run an ad on any article that uses the word abortion. If I write two identical articles and one of them makes an incidental mention of abortion, that one is going to bring in less ad revenue. So this has always gone on. But what's happening now is that instead of having this all go on in private conversations between the media company and the advertiser, now it's all out in the open. The advertiser says, we don't want our ad to run next to this transphobic content. The people who post transphobic content are told they have to pull that content down, and then the anti-trans people organize, and they pass legislation in the state of Florida and Texas. I mean, this is actual legislation that is actually in front of the Supreme Court right now to prevent the social media company from pulling down their anti-trans content. So I bring this up in the context of my earlier remarks about the breakdown of the bipartisan consensus. I think one odd consequence of social media is that it's turning the Republican Party against capitalism. Yes. Because they are discovering that corporate America doesn't necessarily share their values, that corporate America's values are, I do not want my ad running next to these views that are very popular amongst Republicans. And so that is why you're seeing things like Ron DeSantis going after the biggest employer in his state. That is why that's why you're seeing Josh Hawley with his whole weird, anti-corporate agenda. That's why you're seeing the legislation that I mentioned earlier in Florida and Texas. It's because one unexpected consequence of all this being out in the open now, the things that those of us who work in media have already known about, is that it is revealing the preferences of corporate America, and it turns out they aren't what we thought they were.
Can I just, on that subject, in an earlier panel today, we were talking about Citizens United. One of the things about Citizens United that was interesting is most big corporations really hated that decision because companies don't want to be hit up by political groups to have to fund their various campaigns. Most big corporations in America would have been much happier if they were banned from making political contributions. They'll still pay for lobbyists to lobby, but they don't want to have to make these shakedowns with these political figures. And that was, I think, the beginning. That was one of the first signs of this diversion, the difference between corporate America and the Republican Party.
Yeah.
But also you have to agree that there's been a big gutting of the trust and safety and the content moderators in the platforms. I don't think that we should go into that right now because we've got other stuff that we should be talking about, but it is also the economics, and with the big layoffs that the platforms have undergone over the last year or so, they've really gutted a lot of the content moderators and the trust and safety people that we would, for example, talk to about best practices or better practices to fight disinformation, for example. There are very few people to talk to over there these days. So, but, yeah.
Literally.
Well, I didn't want to say that, but yeah, say that. Anyway.
So we have a question from a student that I think is really good. So in all public schools, who should be responsible for the promotion or limitation of free speech? Does it start and stop with the teachers? Does the elected school board have too much influence right now? Should administrators be involved, or does it go as far as the state and federal government? And I think Leo would be excellent to take this one first.
All right. I am glad that we kind of get back to centering students in this, because I think that they are ultimately the most important. And unfortunately, like even up on this panel, like I feel a bit like a bit of a hypocrite because there is no student voice here, and there should be. We would all, rightfully so, not be okay with a bunch of men passing women's health legislation. And we would all rightfully not be okay with a bunch of billionaires sitting around in a room making, legislation that impacts the rest of us who are not billionaires. And yet, and still, when it comes to this discussion, it ends up being a bunch of adults kind of talking back and forth over the kids' heads, which are the ones that are being impacted by this. There is no like simple solution to who should be passing this legislation or who should be ultimately in charge of it. But no matter what, configuration you come with, there should be students that are involved in that process. This is legislation that impacts them. And to not have them involved in that process is neglect. And it begs the question, like, who are we serving with this? Because I've been in education for, 18, 20 years. As long as I can remember, I'm a lot older than I look. And in all the content that I've ever taught, which a lot of it is not very easy to get to, and the conversations that we have are not always very pleasant, but I've never once, and this isn't hyperbole, but I've never once had a student walk up to me after class and say, you know what, that was too hard. I did not want to learn that. Now they'll go home and talk to the parents and ask questions, and I'll get emails from their parents that wanted to ask like why I'm teaching that or what the purpose of it is, or they'll talk about themselves as a parent being made uncomfortable at the dinner table. But I've never gotten one of those comments or questions from a student. And I think that part is really telling. Because no matter what we think of kids, they're not too young. They're not too young to learn about complex and complicated topics. They're not too young to understand, the types of books that they like or they don't like. And I think that when it comes to freedom of expression and free speech in schools, it should be a concerted effort between, teachers, administrators, the school board, state legislators, but there has to be the student component and the student voice in that. And if it's not, then we have to question what we're doing and why we're doing it.
Can I
Of course, go ahead.
So, education is something that we do in partnership, right? We do it in partnership between highly trained teachers, highly trained librarians who get degrees in library science, which is actually a professional field of study. So don't underestimate your librarian. We do it with administrators, we do it with school board members, and we do it with parents and with students, right? When we think about students' rights to education, we think about it in terms of a student's right to information. Think about it for a second. It's not about the right to education, it's actually about the student's right to information. And you hear in a lot of the book banning debates about parental rights, right? The parents have the right. The Don't Say Gay law was parental rights in education. It's like living in opposite land, right? You use this language, but you actually mean something other than what you're actually saying. So the parental rights movement is part of what sort of spurred this spread across the country. But parents always have had rights to their child's education. I have 2 kids, and the amount of time that I have had to spend in meetings with their teachers, in helping them with their homework, in going to PTA meetings, which I've never really done because I know that we're videotaping this. I don't want somebody to call me out because I've never been to one. But I could go to one if I wanted to go to one, right?
And now you have to go to one.
I am not going to one. I'm still not going to one. School board meeting, but God bless you guys who do, right? And I know that many of you do and have for years gone to those PTA meetings and go to those school board meetings. There are lots of parental rights in education, but parents don't have the rights to intimidate teachers about what they say in the classroom or the curriculum that they're putting in front of students. They don't have the right to pull a book off a shelf because they don't want their kid to read it. They have the right to not let their kid read it. They don't have the right to not let everybody else's kid read it, right? If a librarian who is trained in library science says that these books are appropriate for this age group, and we want to make them optional and available because a student has the right to information, then those books should be in the shelves. And if there's a challenge to that book, then you know what? You know who gets to decide? Hopefully, there's a committee that's convened by the library and the school that consists of the person who challenged and an administrator from the school and a teacher and some students who all sit down together, read the book, look for what's objectionable, why it was challenged, and then come to a decision together, right? There's due process involved. So, you know, the question of who gets to decide, I would say that we all get to decide, but those 11 people don't get to decide for all the rest of us. Thank you.
Ian or Marcus, would you like to add anything else to that?
We can get to another question.
Another student question was about the concern of free speech that teachers are being limited in. What are the broader ramifications of these laws? Like, could it eventually nix free speech, like, as a whole? Does it just serve as a problem for the children? Like, anybody who wants to take this can go ahead.
I mean, all of us some broad thoughts about, I guess, what the constitutional framework is here. So, constitutionally, like, issues like the Don't Say Gay law are more complicated than just saying, no, you can't do that. So states are allowed to have curriculums. They're allowed to say, for example, we hired you to teach algebra. And so if you decide to spend that time teaching Japanese art history, you're not going to be a teacher in this school district anymore. And that's not any commentary on the worth of learning about Japanese art history. It's just that the state is allowed to decide it's going to have an algebra teacher and not a Japanese art history teacher. And so similarly, as a constitutional matter, Florida has the right to say that our curriculum for high school U.S. history students does not include Harvey Milk. You know, that is just not part of the unit that is part of the mandatory curriculum. But the problem, I mean, first of all, the biggest problem you have with the Don't Say Gay law is it was so vague. Like, it was unclear the way that it was written whether a teacher could, if a teacher had a same-sex spouse, whether they could display a picture, you know, whether they could literally say the word gay. I mean, what happens if you have a student who just asks a question about a character, you know, is this character gay? Is the teacher allowed to respond to that? What happens if you have a gay student who comes to the teacher seeking some sort of counseling? Is the teacher allowed to provide that counseling? It was so vague. Now that DeSantis is no longer a candidate for president, the good news is that there was a court settlement, and it basically drew the line where I am drawing it. And it said that the state can define what its curriculum is. It can't, like, say that if, you know, you incidentally mention this issue, or if, like, you happen to have a book in your your classroom library that has a gay character in it, then you have violated the law. But I guess I bring up that framework to show that, like, there are going to be difficult constitutional questions at the margins here. You know, the rule is not that a teacher is allowed as a teacher to teach literally whatever they want, regardless of whether they hit on all the items on their school's curriculum. You know, they are still government employees, and the government does have some right to say, like, hey, we are paying you to do this thing, make sure you do this thing. I think where I would draw the line, I think the correct place to draw the line is and say, if you have the algebra teacher who incidentally mentions a piece of Japanese art in one of their lectures, that's not a firing offense. And similarly, if you have a teacher in Florida who incidentally mentions something having to do with the concept of homosexuality in one of their lectures, that should also not be a firing offense. But, you know, as a constitutional matter, you know, once we get more sophisticated lawmakers addressing these issues, and they aren't just writing these bills because they want to make political points or give a boost to their presidential campaign, I think it's going to get harder to challenge, to challenge the kinds of stuff that a more sophisticated lawyer could draft, because states actually do have a fair amount of leeway to say things like, look, this is in the curriculum, this is not in the curriculum.
I would say this, like I guess my one point of contention with that part is we can't just kind of take for granted that we're going to all of a sudden get this new wave of politicians that are going to think better and do better. All of that starts in school. And if we are now in schools and in a country in which we are banning books and stifling, intellectual thought, and critical thinking and the inability to have conversations and, oh my God, we actually disagree and we don't know how to handle that, then all we're gonna do is continuously perpetuate this cycle, and it's gonna continue on. And so one of the big issues when it comes to, you know, the idea of free speech in school is that, unfortunately, what it ends up doing is it ends up stifling, you know, that creative thinking and that critical thinking that is absolutely needed in order to make, you know, people more well-rounded and make us more open and make us more empathetic. Because life is gray. It is not black and white. And no teacher is gonna stand up in front of you and say that they have ever been perfect in their life. I step in it proverbially like every single day, and I will make mistakes, and I'm okay with that. And I have to know that when I'm in my classroom, I'm hopefully developing an environment in which if I say something that a student doesn't necessarily agree with or that they think might have been hurtful, that they feel empowered enough to come to me and say, hey, Mr. Glase, I didn't necessarily like that, and these are the reasons why. Or, hey, can we have that discussion in class? Because without that, like, that should be one of the most important things that they learn in school, is not necessarily, you know, what 2 + 2 equals, even though all that stuff is ultimately important. But school is meant for the social part of this and learning how to become, you know, more human and to become young adults and to grow into the people that are going to take over this country and hopefully lead it into a more promising direction the way that we've left it. And by stifling the First Amendment, we are perpetuating that problem. And so we can't take it for granted that, you know, the next wave of politicians is going to do anything better when we're literally passing legislation that stops these kids from critically thinking or seeing themselves in a curriculum. Because when we do that, these kids walk away from classes and from school not being seen or not being heard, and also believing that their teachers don't care, which for most of the teachers that I know is categorically untrue. But when you do fear that you could get in trouble for talking about a controversial topic or about a controversial figure or sharing what might be a controversial opinion, that ends up being what happens. And you know, having the support of other teachers, of administrators, of school districts, of parents is important for teachers to go out there and do the job that they've wanted to do for so long, and that is to educate kids in all the ways. And so every once in a while, if that algebra teacher wants to talk about Japanese art history, why the hell not? Because honestly, like, that's gonna be something that those kids remember. And they're also gonna know that algebra teacher is not just an algebra teacher, but, you know, they're also well-rounded and have other interests as well. And, you know, the really great teachers can also use algebra and combine it with Japanese art history to come up with something even more amazing. So.
It's an excellent point.
Very much so.
Yeah, I mean, and one of the things that we see with this chilling effect where teachers are scared to say something in the classroom is that people are leaving the teaching profession. The people, like, it's not worth it anymore to do this and to get this blowback. So if the teachers are not going to be allowed to teach and we have a problem filling the teaching slots, the kids are not able to get the information that they need to be able to think and know and learn and read, right? We have a real crisis in critical thinking, but we have an even bigger crisis in democracy. And I think that coming into this from that frame is really important to understand. So while I said before, I'm going to take back what I said, I haven't been to the PTA meeting. But I will tell you that if there was stuff going down in my school district and in my kids' school, I would be the first one there. And I would be the first one there at the school board meeting too. And I would organize my friends to all be there as well. And that is something that all of us, whether you have kids in school right now or not, whether you were parents in the school district, whether you were teachers or librarians, need to remain vigilant around. Because the only way to fight back against this stuff is to get involved and to jump in.
There's a number of questions about disinformation and revisionism from the audience. I'm just going to composite them into one good question. How do you put, this is applicable to literature, to academia, and to the media, I feel like. How do you properly put forth something that's defined as revisionism so that way there's not concerns about it being misinformation?
I'm not sure I understand.
Um, the ever-changing fields of mostly history, there's a lot of questions over whether or not
I see.
something is real or if it's a building theory.
So like, how do we critique the mainstream theory?
Yes, and how do you support or how do you build a system that people can feel confident in the new stuff that they're learning that is challenging their previous beliefs?
I mean, I would say this has always gone on in a non-political way. You know, I think historians, academics, they're constantly reviewing their understanding of things, and our understandings change as the world evolves. What's happening now, the kind of revisionism that we're seeing, it's a politically intentional revisionism. It's designed to create some kind of political reaction. In fact, I think listening to this whole conversation, the thing that keeps coming through my head is, you know, book banning and demands on what teachers teach. These are being imposed not necessarily, and perhaps not at all, from deeply held beliefs. This goes to the 11 people who are driving many of the book bans. They are designed to be political provocations, and the political provocations are designed to engender outrage in most cases on the left, because that outrage sort of feeds the support of people on the right. This goes back to my comment that we're in something of a cultural revolution, and everything is about the politics. It's not necessarily, or maybe at all, about the underlying issues. I'm sure there are parents who are concerned about what's being taught to their 8-year-olds in elementary school, and they found a book on a shelf that they think is totally inappropriate for their kid. I'm sure that exists. I'm not doubting that. But these are national campaigns. There are people who are organizing these things across the country, and that, to the revisionism thing, that's also part of it. You figure out something that will be provocative, and you launch a campaign to revise an understanding of history, knowing that it's going to trigger a reaction. And so I don't know how we get back to what used to be the normal process, because as long as there's political capital to be earned doing it this way, it's going to keep happening. And I want to say one thing. On the other side of this, the language that is used by people who are defending against these kinds of actions, the phrase book ban, which Penn correctly uses a lot in its campaigns and its efforts on this, is a good phrase, because if you do in polling, you find that Americans right and left don't like the idea of book bans. So, not all the things that are described as book bans are really book bans. With all due respect to Penn, Penn does really important and good work, but by calling it a book ban, it also has a political advantage on the left, because it gets people exercised like they don't want book bans, even if some of these things aren't full-on book bans. So both sides are using this for political purposes.
If you don't mind, I might push back against one of the premises of the question.
Go for it, please.
I think
This is
that
a freedom of
disinformation
expression
is
panel.
overrated as a problem in our society. I think the underrated problem in our society is non-information. And you see this especially in the media. So that we are living through a 25-year-long collapse of media in the United States at the sub-national level. We still have very good coverage of national politics. We have virtually non-existent coverage of local politics and very little coverage of state politics. The reason why, the biggest factor in this is a website that most of you have probably haven't heard the name of for 15 years, Craigslist. The biggest factor is that newspapers used to get all of their money from classified ads, and Craigslist came along, they vacuumed up all the classified ads, and national outlets, Vox, the Washington Post, we still have a big enough audience that when you aggregate all the people in the United States, that's a big enough audience that you could still make money through subscriptions and ads. But if you are the Indiana paper, there aren't enough people in Indiana, unless you're really, really popular, to sustain a lot of journalism through subscriptions and ads. There are entire countries. I don't know if, say, Great Britain has enough people in it that it will always be possible for them to sustain media through subscriptions and ads. You just need a huge potential base of readers. And so, I mean, disinformation, it's a problem, but the reason why disinformation is able to thrive is because it operates in a vacuum. And the vacuum is created by the fact that no one has a good business model right now to do journalism at the subnational level.
I think that when it comes to revisionist history, like, debating history should be a good thing. Like, us being able to talk about history, what happened, how it happened, why it happened, its ramifications, should always be something that is, you know, discussed and talked about, whether it's in a classroom or not. I would also argue that when it comes to a lot of politicians, that a lot of what they're trying to do is not trying to rewrite history, but they are actually trying to preserve history the way that it was written. You know, coming up with new thoughts, new intellectual ideas, new topics, is something that does make the status quo a bit nervous. Looking at, you know, tons of textbooks, the history textbooks that come out of Texas, you know, and other states every single year, in which, you know, we talk about George Washington being the first president, but don't want to talk about the fact that he enslaved people. We would like to talk about, you know, Thomas Jefferson, the Declaration of Independence, but we don't want to talk about, you know, Sally Hemings. She's not mentioned in textbooks whatsoever. And so trying to keep history the way that it is, to me, has been, you know, a pretty big detriment to the subject of history moving forward. And to me, I mean, obviously I'm biased. Like, I do believe that history is the greatest subject on earth because I think it's one of the subjects that can involve almost every other, you know, academic, you know, subject that you can think of. And it's hopefully is meant to not make us into historians or make us love history, but hopefully it makes us have, you know, discussions and actually turns us into better human beings. And so for me, when it comes to history, I think one of the reasons why I've been successful in the classroom is the fact that I try to bring history to life, and to me, like, history should be dynamic and not static. If I'm teaching the same exact thing every single year, year after year, I'm not doing my job correctly. If I'm not out there, you know, looking at, you know, the latest scholarship or the latest opinion piece from, you know, a historian or this other person or new evidence that's come along, then I'm not doing my job as a teacher, and I'm not doing my job, most importantly, to those students, which gives them the idea that history is not just, you know, these permanent words that are written in an old textbook that is 700 pages long, but that we can learn history from news articles, that we can learn it from, you know, the internet, that we can learn it from each other, that we can learn it as we kind of pass that word down from other people. And so when it comes to revisionist history, I think revisionist history is great. It allows us to look at history in a different light, in a different lens, in a different time period. But what I think a lot of people that are in power are trying to do is they're actually trying to preserve the history that we have, which in some cases has led us to where we are today. And I'd imagine that most of us are not always exactly happy with the direction of this country. And so allowing us to think about history in new ways, and I think about the ways it can inform the future, are ultimately important. But I do think that a lot of politicians and a lot of other adults out there would like to keep history the way that it was and the way that they learned it, because it keeps them safe and comfortable, and it keeps them in the same position that they've been in.
We've touched a little bit on it before with the role of social media and the freedom of expression. How does social media and the massive amount of information available, not just to parents, but students who are directly affected by this, how does social media change or affect their reaction to what is going on, even if it's in a state that is completely across the country?
I worry that social media is diminishing the quality of the information, I mean, even though there's more of it. So my employer, Vox, was the industry leader in streaming online video. We produced these incredibly well-done professional videos that, like, you know, we had expert reporters working on them, we had expert fact checkers, they were these very well-done professional products, and we recently laid off our entire team. And the reason why is because the way that YouTube's business model works, or, you know, I think it's the same for TikTok if you try to make money there, is that if you are a 22-year-old and you have strong opinions and you're pretty and you have video editing skills as a sole proprietor, you can make a ton of money off of YouTube. But once you start layering in the expenses that go into producing a professional, journalistically rigorous product, you hire a reporter who actually knows what they're talking about and who actually does the research and reporting. You try to make it look professional. You have fact checking. You have editors. You have all the checks that go into. You can't make money off of YouTube that way. Like, the amount that they pay content providers isn't enough that a professional media company can pay all of the staffers that you need to pay in order to produce a really well done and accurate factual product. And so I worry that one thing that is happening is that really good, really rigorous journalism and other, really well done, factually accurate, thoughtful material is getting pushed out in favor of people whose primary skills is that they're telegenic and they have video editing skills. I mean, my dog shows up on my TV hits sometimes, so it's fine.
But I will say that my 16-year-old named Leo, who really likes Instagram, really likes Instagram, came to me the other day and said, or I guess it was last month, and said, Florida is trying to ban all social media for kids under 16. I know, because I was working on trying to advocate against it. And so I said to him, guess what I've been doing all day long today, right? But he wouldn't have known that, right? Now, again, it kind of goes back to what's the role of parents, right? We have these conversations in my house, right? He also is very disturbed by the curation of what is coming through his feed on the Israel-Gaza situation. And he says to me, everything that I believe isn't actually on Instagram. And that allowed us to go into a really deep conversation about what it was that he believed and kind of the nuance and what he was not seeing in terms of what was being presented to him. Parents have really big jobs, and part of that job is to curate through conversations of what is in social media. I don't do it perfectly, for sure, because I don't know what the other son, is looking at. But where there is an opening for that conversation, social media can be a really strong tool to help have conversations about what is going on in the world. But you have to be really vigilant, and it is really exhausting to do that, and to do that in a way where that he told me about 2 stories he was seeing. The other 800 billion that he spent 22 hours of his day looking at, I don't know what he saw, right? And it scares me.
Well, I'm not a fan of the social media companies in the sense that I think they've chronically underspent on content moderation, on understanding how young people are affected by their products. And I mean, everybody I'm sure knows now the correlation, I don't know the causation, but the correlation between the growth of social media and teen suicides, and especially among girls. I hope some of you may have seen the video when Mark Zuckerberg was testifying in front of Congress, and the otherwise odious Josh Hawley persuaded Mark Zuckerberg to turn around and make an attempt at an apology to parents whose kids had died because of suicide resulting from social media or connected to social media. I would make one sort of factual observation about the social media companies and my continuing crusade against them. The Facebook, or Meta, the company that owns Facebook, is about the same size, or was a couple of years ago, I don't know right now, in revenues as General Motors. General Motors has net profit margins of 7%. Facebook has consistently had net profit margins of about 45%. And when Nick Clegg, who's a failed British politician who serves as president of Facebook's global operation, says, as he often does, we spend billions on content moderation. It's true they spend billions on content moderation, but they're not spending enough. They're not spending enough on the product that they serve to the public so that it's a safe product. It would be as if General Motors distributed cars without brake lights or speed regulators or steering wheels. And I think, I don't think we as a society should give them a pass. I think we should stay consistently hard against the tech companies and their understanding of their role in society, because I don't think they act as responsibly.
Unfortunately, we are now out of time. I just wanted to close by saying thank you all for being so passionate about freedom of expression and offering such unique views. And I just wanted to say, as a student and a history major who wants to eventually teach in academia, I very much echo Leo's statement that it's a collaborative effort, but the students' voices need to be heard. And that's on every level, whether it's kindergarten, whether it's first grade through 12th grade, or especially on a college campus such as this. I think it's incredibly important to value the students, since they are the ones who are directly affected by this. Thank you all for coming here.